Cześć, tu Anna Kurowicka
i Marta Usiekniewicz
w podcaście Oswoić Gender. Obie zajmujemy się badaniami w ramach studiów o seksualności i płci kulturowej, czyli gender, a od tego roku jesteśmy współkierowniczkami Pracowni Gender Sexualities w Ośrodku Studiów Amerykańskich Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego.
Naszym celem jest przedstawienie Wam ciekawych projektów badawczych z tej interdyscyplinarnej, a w ostatnich latach często demonizowanej dziedziny.
W tym sezonie przedstawimy Wam badaczki i badaczy związanych z UW i nie tylko.
Porozmawiamy z nimi o tym, co badają i dlaczego. Podpytamy też o to, jak to się stało, że zajęli się tematyką gender i seksualności. No i sprawdzimy, czy nie mają nigdzie śladów pogryzień, bo gender, wbrew złej prasie, wcale nie gryzie. Ten odcinek podcastu jest wyjątkowy. Po pierwsze, proszę nie regulować odbiorników, reszta odcinka będzie w języku angielskim, ponieważ naszymi gośćmi są Huw Lemmy i Ben Miller, czyli prowadzący podcast Bad Gays i autorzy książki Bad Gays, A Homosexual History.
Oprócz tego nagrywałyśmy ten podcast przez internet, zdalnie. To był dla nas pierwszy raz i mamy nadzieję, że jakość będzie bardzo dobra, ale
mogą się tam zdarzyć różne ciekawe dźwięki i odgłosy, ale moim zdaniem to tylko dodaje nam autentyczności i prawdy.
Które, jak wiemy, są bardzo cenioną kategorią w queer studies i w ogóle w kulturoznawstwie.
Autentyczność i prawda, tak.
Welcome to the very special episode of Oswoić Gender, where clearly I can't decide what accent I'm speaking in, and also where we are talking in English to two hosts of another podcast that talks about queer and gender stuff and wants to address a bigger audience with that.
So, Ben, Huw, welcome to Oswoić Gender.
Thank you for having us.
I'm sure the listeners of our podcast need no introduction to the hosts of Bad Gays. I think your podcast was recommended in one of our first episodes in first season, so I assume that our audiences are listening kind of parallel to what we're doing and to your episodes. But we want to make sure that people know who you are. So, Ben Miller is a writer and a historian, co-host of the Bad Gays podcast, and co-author of Bad Gays, A Homosexual History. He is a doctoral fellow at the Graduate School of Global Intellectual History at the Freie Universität Berlin, has taught on queer history, literature, and visual cultures at the Humboldt University, Freie University, and NYU Berlin. Since 2018, Ben has been a member of the board of the Schwules Museum.
Okay, Huw Lemmy is the other co-host of the podcast and the co-author of the book, and also a novelist, artist, and a critic living in Barcelona. He is the author of 3 novels, Unknown Language, Red Tory, My Corbyn Chemsex Hell, and Chubs, The Demonization of My Working Hours. He writes on culture, sexuality, and cities for The Guardian, Frieze, Flash Art, Tribune, Tank, The Architectural Review, Art Monthly, New Humanist, Rhizome, The White Review, and L'Uomo Vogue, amongst others. He writes the weekly essay series Utopian Drivel.
What we do usually in our episodes is that we start by asking our guests to talk about their journey, quote unquote, towards gender, or in your case, maybe queer studies or LGBTQ studies. I don't know how you identify yourself. So if you could tell us kind of your, let's say, intellectual biography that led you to where you are right now, that would be great. And maybe we can start with Huw.
Well, I guess what led me to my interest in queer history was having sex with men. And from that, sort of wondering what that meant, you know, how that identity came about. And yeah, the sort of predecessors to that and what my history and culture means as a result. I'm not a historian by any sort of training or, I don't regard myself as a historian particularly. I'm someone with an interest in history, but I came to it through just trying to sort of understand and figure out my own position. So yeah, I guess that's my intellectual history is not an intellectual history. It's a curiosity that's just taken over, I guess.
It's a wonderful way of queering the concept of intellectual history is by, proving that you don't have it, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's not something I have any let's say I have any academic training of, but it's something I have my own healthy interest in. So that's where it came from. But as a result, sort of reading queer histories and teaching myself as a result, I guess, what does and doesn't seem right to me, what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And then seeing where the gaps are and where the places are that I want to learn and I can't find some of that information, or I think maybe particularly helpfully, because I don't come from an academic background and I'm not a historian, the stuff that I can't find because it's not in public history, it's sort of harder to find, and when you find it, it's written in a way that I find that's more obscure or like is more for an academic audience, and it's not for me. Has been like an interesting starting point, and I think was kind of the starting point in some ways for the podcast.
Brilliant. And tell me, were there any kind of turning points by way of books or experiences that kind of shifted how you approach this subject or got you more involved or differently involved? I'm wondering.
One of the most interesting sort of books that I read that really changed the way I thought about the way you can write about queer experience was a book called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue by Samuel Delany, who's perhaps best known as a sci-fi author, but he writes amazing nonfiction as well. And it was a book that was sort of split in two. It's a strange book. And one half of it is his personal experiences of cruising in New York, and especially in sex cinemas from the I think late 1950s, like maybe 1960s, right up until the 90s. And he sort of explores that as a personal, affective, emotional story, first of all. And then the second part of the book, he explores the same story, but through a sort of more theoretical lens, looking at his relationship with gentrification and urban studies and social studies and various sort of philosophies of how and why people come together in those ways in cities. And that for me was a really eye-opening book, because it was one that put his own personal experience and his own desire to understand his personal experience right at the center, and treated it in a non-scandalous way. You know, it's just a way he enjoyed having sex for decades. And he wanted to sort of understand it more. And for me, that was really a really exciting way to approach gay sex.
Yeah, thank you. And Ben, what about you?
Huw always gives the disclaimer that I come from the more traditional academic historian's background and he doesn't. And that's true it is true on the face of it. But I actually think that our ways in were quite similar in a lot of ways. I mean, I feel like my academic training hasn't really informed my approach as much as this exact same kind of curiosity and searching for the answers to questions that did not feel satisfactorily answered by various sort of official sources. That has really then gone back and informed the work that I have done in an academic environment, as opposed to the other way around, if that makes sense. The first radical queer text that I was ever exposed to was probably Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart, which is about the first years of the AIDS epidemic in New York City. And then I have gone on a kind of long political journey from Kramer to where I am now. I would say pretty far away from Kramer's conclusions in that play, but still at least somewhat influenced by by the righteousness of his anger.
Would you be able to, or would you like to say a little bit more about Kramer's politics and how that trajectory works, just for our listeners who are maybe not so familiar with that figure?
Yeah, sure. Larry Kramer, for people who don't know, was a writer and activist who lived in New York City for most of his adult life. He died in 2021, I believe, or 2020, during the COVID pandemic. And he became an extremely prominent AIDS activist and wrote these incredibly sort of raw and powerful agitprop plays and articles that were intended to spur people to political action. He was one of the people who co-founded the political group ACT UP, which is one of the kind of iconic political organizations of anti-AIDS organizing in New York City and then globally. And what continues to be inspiring to me about Kramer's politics is his insistence on action and his insistence on doing something and his insistence on the kind of ethical responsibility to act in community with others. And the problem with Kramer's politics is that I think his anger was often misdirected and often led him to collaborate with evil, not to be too dramatic about it. But, he ended up blaming a lot of people for their deaths and taking a really kind of anti-sex stance that I find it difficult to put together with either the kind of best public health knowledge and activism of the time, things like Mike Callan and Richard Berkowitz's book, How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, which came out in 1984, with the exception of PrEP, the new technology. That book is still completely true and up to date. And I also find it difficult to reconcile with kind of today's queer politics.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know, Ben, if you want to add something more to kind of other threshold moments or your academic trajectory, or are you fine with this? Because I don't want to cut you off if there's anything more that you would like to elaborate on.
I should also add, there's a book by the historian Martin Duberman called Hold Tight Gently, which is a dual biography of Mike Callan, one of the two people who wrote How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, and the Black gay poet Essex Hemphill. And that book was hugely inspiring when I first read it, when it first was published in 2015, I believe, 14, both as a history of that time period and of that movement that got into sort of more of the complexities than Kramer's work had. And also as an example of how to tell a series of really complicated stories about the different kinds of AIDS activist movements, about conflicts within those movements around race and class, through compellingly told life stories, and the way that storytelling and narrative in history could be a really compassionate and finely honed tool to actually convey complicated stories to people in a way that they are interested in and take on. And that was something that really inspired me then and continues to. And all of Duberman's work in general, but that book in specific.
You talk about the kind of value of explaining complex or difficult or inaccessible histories via kind of those personal narratives, which is kind of maybe similar to what your podcast, Bad Gays, and to some extent your book, Bad Gays, A Homosexual History, has done. However, with, let's say, problematic, as you refer to them, problematic figures of the LGBTQ plus history. And I wanted to ask you to explain why that focus on the quote-unquote bad gays in history, and what do we gain from investigating or hearing those stories?
Well, I think like that question was really at the center of like when we started doing the podcast, and I think that partly comes as well from this sort of maybe divergence in mine and Ben's backgrounds, because while I think like a lot of these conversations are ongoing within academia around queer history and gender and sex, like I think what's happening in the public debate is quite different. And we're at a strange sort of point, especially when we started the podcast, we're at this very strange sort of point within general sort of conversation around LGBTQ people in the US, the UK, Western Europe, perhaps, around a sort of more general acceptance of LGBTQ people in society. And that as I'm, not from that academic background, that sort of more public facing aspect of it is what I was reading, what I was experiencing. And one thing I noticed was that as there was more public acceptance of LGBTQ people, there were more stories that featured LGBTQ people in the mainstream. But those stories were becoming more and more simplified. And the role of the LGBTQ person, I guess, as a counter to the long history of the sort of queer person as the deviant or corrupter, or as a sad figure, or as a figure of humiliation or something, was just being replaced by this other stock figure of the queer person as the inspiring, transformative, fashion friendly best friend figure. And I was like, this is even worse for me personally. This was even worse because it was flat, but it was also boring. Whereas at least in the past, all our sort of pop culture gay devils were at least interesting figures, and there was something to get from that. And so and that was sort of mirrored really in like a public history, I think, that was happening in media in the West at the time, very much around, here's our top 10 list of gay heroes for Pride Month. Here's the top 10, engineers you didn't know were gay or something like this. And you're like, oh God, really dull. And also like the stories that they were telling were quite simple, which was there's always been these brilliant people who were suppressed in their sexuality. And from my personal reading on history, I was like, well, this isn't the case. And a lot of these stories are much more complicated. And then also my own sort of interest and research for my books and novels and things, always coming across these historical figures who were LGBTQ but terrible. And I was like, well, where do these people fit into this public history? So that's why we started the podcast. And actually, of course, when you're telling the stories of villains, it's far more interesting quite often, and it's in some ways often more illuminating because, say, the story of someone like Alan Turing, who has been sort of rehabilitated by the British state after being persecuted and hounded to death by the British state, as a sort of hero of the Second World War and this British code-breaking genius. The story of his sexuality just touches very minorly on actually what makes him a great man, which was his computing genius, his brain. But it only emerges really as part of his story at the end. So his sexuality is kind of only a small part of the story. Whereas when you start to tell the stories of some really evil figures, I'm thinking someone like Roy Cohn, for example, the American lawyer who was involved in the Red Scare, or even just sort of more complicated figures like James the First and Sixth, then their sexuality plays a huge part in their stories, but that's not really brought up very much and is weirdly sidelined. So when their sexuality is a small part of their story, it becomes the whole story, like someone like Turing. And when their sexuality is a really important part of a bad story, it gets sidelined. So I guess it was a bit of a corrective to that. And I think it was also a thing that me and Ben wanted to do, which was to tell stories that we want to hear, because so many of the ways in which this sort of popular history of like LGBTQ heroes was told was a bit like the sort of fictional LGBT figures that are starting to emerge more and more in sort of Western pop culture. Those stories were kind of told for the benefit of straight people. And I think both Ben and I felt like, well, we're kind of beyond this. Like most queer people I know don't need a list of 10 LGBTQ heroes. They want to hear more interesting stories, and so did I. So that's why we started the podcast. And I think those stories that we tell, we use to sort of have a wider discussion on bigger sort of queer themes of identity production and reception.
Something that I found very persuasive was when you talked about those predominantly white gay men who you wrote about in your book, is that so much of their sexuality influenced their politics. And that was another justification for examining them also through the lens of their sexuality, because it had impact on some very sometimes atrocious politics that then they put into practice. And this for me was very persuasive, right? Like, we are very happy to say how someone's queerness makes their art better, right? But we, especially if we represent the more mainstream society, maybe we are not as eager to talk about how someone's sexuality might have influenced something for the quote unquote bad.
I mean, anyone who's ever been to a gay art exhibition will be able to tell you the many, many ways in which someone's sexuality can make their art worse. But I think you've hit it right. You've hit the nail right on the head there. I mean, the idea was that through telling these life stories, we could get at something a little bit bigger and more important about the ways in which certain versions of queer sexual identities, and oftentimes the most kind of mainstream and influential versions of those identities, or maybe sort of extra burlesqued and extreme versions of concepts that are contiguous with quite broadly accepted ideas in gay identities, have these really kind of dark roots and emerge in correspondence with some really horrifying historical stuff. I mean, to give you one example, we talk about the gay Nazi Ernst Röhm, who's one of Hitler's main deputies, who's the leader of the SA, which is the predecessor to the SS. He ends up being purged in the Night of the Long Knives fairly soon after the Nazis take power, and is purged basically because he wants to become defense minister, and the conservatives who enabled the rise of Hitler don't want that. He is pretty openly gay. His homosexuality is revealed by the Social Democratic Party before the elections that the Nazis do well enough in to be enabled into power by the conservatives. And he is also someone who understands his homosexuality as part of a coherent political sexuality. I mean, if we're thinking about our Foucault and our acts becoming identities, this is someone who is absolutely assigned a social and political meaning and an identification to his sexual acts. And yet he's a Nazi. When you compare his political homosexuality, right, which is based on the superiority of male bonding, the abrogation of women, the idea that what he's talking about is very different from kind of effeminate Jewish homosexuality emblematized by someone like Magnus Hirschfeld. And then you look at the relationship that gay men have with masculinity and our own bodies, there are certainly enough continuities to make us uncomfortable in the present. And I think that was our goal when we were working on the book. The idea of the book is not to cancel or to declare people problematic and then move on. There's a great quote from the gay writer Garth Greenwell that I often think about with the project, where he said that, for me, problematic is a criterion of interest, right? It's the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And I think the idea of it is that we as white gay men are creating this project which is about problematizing white gay men and about sort of implicating ourselves, right, and making ourselves uncomfortable in the present. And I think if we're not a little bit uncomfortable, then we're not doing our jobs.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've outlined your project, especially the bed part. And this example of Ernst Röhm is maybe one of the most striking ones, and also ones that are sort of most easily understood in this context of badness, because we're also intrigued by the title that you went with, both for the podcast and for the book, and how it sort of touches on or plays with these homophobic moralizing takes on homosexual identity on the one hand, when it comes to bed, but then also if we think about gayness and the scope of your project, which goes pretty far and wide when it comes to searching for historical figures you're interested in, I was wondering if you could say more about how you understand this term gay in this context, especially considering the challenges of applying identity categories sort of backwards in time.
We regard the category gay like extremely expansively, I think. The title is a provocation in some ways, and in other ways just a starting point of a conversation. We quite often end the show by sort of discussing, was this person bad or not bad? Were they gay or not gay? And that is kind of the concept of I guess in some ways the whole show. And well, the obvious sort of provocation of the title was this gay bad? The title also suggests something that we've discussed quite a lot between ourselves, which was this person bad at being gay? And what does that mean as our current identity category? And so, yeah, this sort of problem that you discuss about retroactively using this identity category that emerges relatively recently to discuss people from the distant and not so distant past. That's something that we discuss frequently on the show. That's part of the conversation, is a sort of historiographical conversation, I guess, about what does it mean to do that. And, it's a popular history, so it is a provocation and an easy access point for people to talk about, let's say, deviant sexualities within various cultures. But at the same time, I think I like to think we regard our audience as pretty intelligent people. And of course, if you're talking about someone from the 16th century, the category of gay is much more complicated and you can't just do that. So we have that conversation. And I think throughout the show, in determining whether someone's bad or not bad, gay or not gay, we just try to show our working out. We say like, this is the evidence that we've sort of come up with. This is what we're discussing. This is our argument. But of course, you could use the same sources and come up with a different conclusion about, and especially about whether, in a lot of cases, rumors around someone's homosexuality were believable or not believable. So yeah, I think both bad and both gay are simplistic provocations to a much more complicated conversation that we want to have.
If there is one or two listeners who don't know your podcast, I want to say that the expansiveness of the historical figures include Alexander the Great and Gertrude Stein and Morrissey and Margaret Mead and so many other figures from history. However, your book specifically, I think, focuses mostly on white gay men, if I am correct, with the exception of Margaret Mead. And I'm wondering, why that narrowing specifically for the book?
There's two people in the book who are white men, Margaret Mead and Yukio Mishima. And I'll explain why in a minute. But first, I want to say something else about bad and gay and how we use them. Because I'm the historian and I'm theoretically the defender of the disciplinary standards and of the idea that, which is actually something that's really important to us, and it might at first glance look like a contradiction, that on the one hand, we are really dedicated to telling the story of how gay as we understand it came to be and came to exist, and destabilizing that as the only way to think about how you might take same-sex behavior and put it into a social context, right? And at the same time, we run around using the term gay with happy ahistorical abandon. And I think it's that we look for people when we're going outside of that career of gay, right? When we're going back into a time when that word makes no sense, right? The question, was Hadrian gay, makes no sense, right? It's like asking, did Mozart like an iPad, or did Queen Victoria eat sushi, right? Like, it's just, we're talking about a different people and activities that don't go together. This doesn't mean that there were no people who were living gender trouble or living in things that we might call trans experience or having gay sex, etc., at various times. But it does mean that the sort of coherent gay identity didn't exist during the lives of a lot of the people that we talk about. And so when we use it for those people, we think about how the stories of these people helps us then talk more about what gay became and what it is now, right? So someone like Frederick the Great or someone like Alexander the Great helps us understand how late 19th century gay men who are searching for ways to kind of create a positive identity out of this kind of medical diagnosis of homosexuality at the time, are looking back into history, looking to the past, looking for people who are kind of recognizable national heroes in order to find models for what they should be. And so even if they weren't gay in their time, their lives become gay through kind of historical reinterpretation and reappreciation later on. The show is at this point very mixed. So on the show, we're talking about a sort of wide variety of different kinds of people. And the other fun thing about the show is that we get to have a really huge variety of tone. So sometimes we're talking about, someone like Rehm, who's a Nazi, and sometimes we're talking about Joe Carstairs, who's an eccentric British oil heir who races speedboats before having an affair with Marlene Dietrich that doesn't go well. And so when Dietrich dumps them, they move to a private island in the Bahamas that they rule over with a foot-tall leather doll named Lord Todd Wadley, who ends up becoming their life partner. Right. And there's a lot of really kind of horrifying details in that story about race and colonialism and, of course, oil. But right, that's tonally different from Ernst Rehmann Nazis. In the book, we decided that, we were talking with our editor, Leo Hollis at Verso, who was really fantastic and really helped shape the project a lot. And we were talking about ways to make the book something more than just a kind of written collection of the show. And what we decided to do was to focus on one story that we were really the most interested in telling. And we batted around a few ideas, but what we kept coming back to was this story about the creation of the white gay man as an identity figure. How did that happen? How does the white gay man go from being a contradiction in terms in 1850 to, by 1970, 1980, the kind of dominant identity format underneath the queer umbrella? And the way that we told that story was by talking about the lives of a lot of white gay men, or a lot of people who are kind of important to the creation of that white gay male identity. The two exceptions we made, we think, are very important. One of them is Margaret Mead, who writes works of anthropological theory that are unbelievably important for gay male movements, which look to her work for kind of natural justification of what it is they're advocating for. And then we look at Mishima to see what happens when the white gay man metastasizes globally, right? Escapes from the confines of Europe and starts influencing people and places and identity formations abroad. What does that look like? What does he look like? What does he do? How do these identity formats look and work in different ways? And that was something that we thought was important to tell sort of alongside that main story.
This is something incredibly interesting for me, because obviously right now it's so easy to, on the one hand, criticize a project or a book because it focuses on, only white gay male experience, right? We have seen, and this happens a lot in sexuality studies or queer studies in Poland, where people say queer and what they mean is white gay men, and do it without, thinking twice about these repercussions. And then obviously one way of quickly addressing this is to just slap on like a one woman or one, person of color, or just like adding on something so that, being very tokenistic about it. And I feel that the way you have framed or included these two non-white males or gays is a brilliant way of kind of, for me at least, avoiding that either tokenism or that, kind of erasure of experience other than white and gay. And like, I find it incredibly inspiring, on how you can shape a project in such a way that it, in kind of what could potentially be its weakness is actually its strength, right? That the choice of the two, not like the others, is not there to be a defense against accusation of narrow, of being too narrow or anything like that, or reiterating some privileges, but instead kind of helping to even further elaborate why this focus has a point.
Well, hopefully. I mean, it was a conversation that we had at the time between ourselves and also with our editor, Leo Hollis at Verso. And I can't remember exactly, but I think the original proposal actually had more people in who weren't white gay men, and we discussed the idea that we could have told multiple different stories from the podcast. Like Ben says, it has this variety of tones, and some are more personal, and some are kind of a bit silly, and there's all sorts of stories we tell. In our last season, we ended with a story of a 16th, 17th century mystic nun who was a lesbian who brought down her convent. You could write a book about bad lesbian nuns without a doubt. There's lesbian mystics. There's enough of them in history. So we had to choose the story that we wanted to tell that we felt was compelling and politically useful, I guess, at this time. And so that's why we decided specifically to tell the story of the development of the white gay man, because that is something that has persistently come up in the podcast. So we have all these different narratives. That's the one we chose. And that's open to criticism, of course. But in selecting the people we selected, I think we hopefully did a good job in, as you say, like illustrating that story, and rather than just including people for a sort of quite tokenistic, very surface level idea of inclusion. I think hopefully that's justified. And I also think probably given the nature of the book, it's not the sort of representation that a lot of people are craving anyway. So I'm sure a lot of people don't mind that exclusion. But it's something we've tried to change in the podcast in terms of broadening out of our own comfort zone of, our own historical research and our own social backgrounds, I guess. And actually in the first season, we only covered men. And we sort of made a little joke in the season about it, saying, because men are sort of definitionally more evil than women. And we got a very nice email at the end of the season from a lesbian saying, "Thanks so much for the season. I really, really enjoyed it." But that sort of little joke always annoyed me, because you sort of have a quite structuralist critique of the creation of gay identity and also of these men's lives. And then you come in with this sort of essentialist notion at the end as a joke. Please, can you do some lesbians? So from that point on, we've tried to keep expanding into sort of, lesbians and bisexuals, and also, of course, people with different gender identities and people from outside our sort of comfort zone as an American studying in Germany and a British guy. So, that's like a sort of ongoing conversation I guess we've had. But you can't win them all. We did get criticism, I think, a bad review of our Gertrude Stein episode, where the reviewer was saying 2 gay guys attacking a lesbian woman is not a good look, boys, which is the exact opposite, which was our sort of thought process behind the first series. I think we didn't want to start a series by saying, we're 2 gay men and here's a list of all lesbians we hate.
My response to the not a good look thing would be like, well, is it a good look for a Jewish writer to ask, maybe slightly impolitely, how it was that 2 foreign lesbians made it through the Second World War in France with food? Yeah. And the answer may shock you, but probably won't if you've listened to our show.
For all the criticism that it got, we do recommend that that episode, definitely. And you kind of provided me with a segue to a question, and it's about, let's say, reception of the podcast and of your book and of your approach. I assume that there is a limit to how many homophobic people, give you feedback, but I'm wondering, within your kind of, broadly speaking, dedicated audience, what has been the reception so far?
The reception has been really great. I mean, there were 2 groups of people I was worried about in terms of reaction to the show. The first being, especially as we started branching out of our own kind of subject position, people feeling like we were telling complicated stories wrong, right? And the other group that I was worried about the response from was academics, because sometimes academics can be, and I say this as a person of academic experience, sometimes academics can be a little bit defensive about people operating on territory that they understand as theirs because of the research that they have done. And I have been enormously heartened by the response really from everybody. And I think we talked a little bit about kind of negative response there, but I think that first letter that Huw mentioned a moment ago is actually a really good illustration of the main way that we deal with all kinds of feedback, which is that when people write us with feedback, whether it's positive or negative, if it's detailed and worth responding to, we will respond to it. And we end up having often very long conversations with people. Sometimes they end up on the show as guests. Sometimes it just sort of stays in that DM or email place. And we have these great conversations, which really are, even if people are criticizing us or are naming things that we could be doing better, that's an enormous investment of their time and energy in the improvement of our show. And it's something that we try to not take for granted and to really kind of answer in good faith. And it's something that's really informed the show, the development of the show, and our confidence level as we approach some of these more complicated topics.
Yeah, I think that at that point on the confidence it's given us to know that we have people who are invested in the show and are pleased that people are having these conversations in public has been really important. So there's definitely subjects that I think if we'd started in the first season we wouldn't have covered, because we wouldn't have had that understanding that there were people who wanted us to have really, really difficult conversations sometimes in public about these things. So, for example, issues that deal with childhood sexual abuse and also like historical pederasty within gay male cultures. That's, I think, something that we wouldn't have touched in the first season straight off the bat. But having had increasingly difficult conversations on the show, or complicated conversations, and then realizing that people, really value that we felt confident enough to say, okay, like there are enough LGBTQ people out there who are prepared and want to hear a conversation about, for example, pederasty within gay male culture and how that's gone on to shape the gay male identity, that we can actually do that in a sensitive a way as we possibly can, and have that conversation between ourselves almost. And I say between ourselves, not as in between me and Ben, but between all ourselves, us and the listeners as LGBTQ people, without sort of the idea that we're sort of either homophobic or adding fuel to a homophobic fire around those questions.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it all as a process, right? Because especially when you think about the book and about the books, we also tend to consider, finished product in a way. But of course, there is a lot behind the scenes, and what you just described about the process and thinking about what to include and how to talk about things sort of as the podcast develops and as you think about what was missing maybe from the first seasons. That's also a fascinating insight into this whole process. So I also wanted to ask about any challenges you had in compiling these stories. And I don't know, I was thinking here about either like practical in terms of historical research or any other challenges. You already mentioned some, but if there's anything else that comes to mind, we'd love to hear about the challenges and the difficult parts as well.
I would say the main practical challenge that we faced, and is really the only time that we've turned back from trying to tell a story, have been when we run into a language barrier where there's just sources that we can't get at because of our inability to read them. I'll give you an example. There's a lesbian Burmese drug cartel magnate named Olive Yang, who we've been circling around for years, I think since the second series. And we've made a couple of serious attempts at trying to tell the story, and both times we ran into a wall of our inability to read Burmese. The good news on Olive Yang is that actually this winter there is a journalist who does speak Burmese who's going to be publishing a biography of Yang, and so we're looking forward to having her on the show if she'll come on, and we'll finally be able to tell that story with her assistance. And oftentimes it is the guests that we bring on who help us kind of get to these places that we're not able to get to.
This is actually something that, from the perspective of Polish queer studies, and I am hopefully reflecting the kind of air quotes that I've made, being, let's say, representatives of both the metropolis and the periphery, right? Very often, let's say, stories of queer people in Poland are more of like the archive rather than the source for critical thinking, right? There is this discrepancy, right, where the periphery provides you with the raw material, quote unquote, and then you need a scholar from the West to kind of interpret it and kind of reinterpret it into the mainstream, let's say, Western narrative. And this is something, and this issue of translation, legitimacy of experience, the kind of language, both in terms of Polish and non-Polish, but also language, what language is being used. I mean, this is something that is definitely part of the conversation here in Poland as queer theory is being developed here in this kind of very weird position of both being very heavily inspired, funded, and in general shaped by Western discourses. And at the same time, trying to figure out a way to talk about the experience that is not following the kind of Western historiography of, I don't know, gay history, queer history, and so forth. So it is in some way very interesting to hear back kind of the challenges from, let's say, I don't want to juxtapose us as like on the opposite sides. This is not what I'm doing, but like hearing your struggles, let's say, with language barriers and the kind of anxieties over what archives you have access to and what you don't have access to. I don't know. It's unlike maybe the mainstream reaction to what, let's say, we face when we present what we're doing outside of Poland.
That's very interesting. I found the process on the podcast of having those conversations with Ben, as someone he's trained obviously as a historian, and I'm not, is having those conversations about sources on the podcast, and especially where there's the gaps and the language barriers, for example. To be able to have those conversations in public is kind of part of the podcast, the Bad Gays podcast as well, to talk history and to have those sort of in-depth conversations. Because for me, this is sometimes new territory, because this is not the way that when I'm consuming popular history, I understand it. And hopefully that's informative for the listeners as well. And I think also, but there's also gaps. There's gaps that we can fill in those conversations. Also because we're a popular history podcast, that we can have more informal conversations perhaps than you tell me, I'm talking to all these historians here, that might be possible in the academy by going on our own feelings almost. So what I mean by that is when we have the conversation, for example, and is this guy from history a gay or not gay? Sometimes you reach very little in the way of sources, primary sources, for example, but you can extrapolate in a conversation about the way this person lives their lives, similarities of our own lives, and say, well, like we wouldn't swear in a court of law that this person's gay, but the way he conducts his personal life certainly rings true of a lot of guys I know, for example.
And just to alleviate your worries, Huw, only Ben and our editor are historians present. Anna and I represent the lawless discipline of cultural studies that has absolutely no methodology whatsoever. So don't worry.
Yeah.
I always joke that I live at the corner of history and cultural studies, selling my ass. But I have a lot of words for the discipline of history, and I think there's a lot from outside the discipline that history could really stand to learn from in terms of how it tells stories, how it interprets stories. One of the very few disciplinary standards from history that I do like to bring into the public conversation is the kind of source work and being extremely clear and transparent about what sources are and where they are and how we are making the claims that we're making. And I think oftentimes that's the work that people are really afraid to do in public. And that's certainly a kind of work that I think editors in a lot of public-facing outlets are really scared of. Whenever we've done writing for public outlets, we've had to really fight to keep our citations, fight to keep our sources, fight to keep our discussions in the text of the kind of conflicts between sources and how sources help us tell our stories. And yet I think that is something that really, not only are people not put off by it, I think it's something that really attracts people. I think people see that as an honest way of working. And I also think that I come from a style of doing history influenced by like the history workshops and things like that, where, we assume that people are smart and interested in their lives and how to make sense of them and are capable of looking at sources, analyzing sources, thinking about sources, thinking with and against sources. And so that's something that I am excited about doing with people and in public, and something that we do together.
We maybe would like to ask you one of our favorite questions that we usually leave for the dessert. And this is where we ask our guests for recommendations.
We've already had a few from you at the very beginning, which is amazing, but maybe there's something else that you'd like to share as well.
Anything somewhat related to queer and gender studies, understood as broadly as you guys understand the word gay in your podcast?
Well, actually, there's one really fascinating archive that I was following for a number of years on Facebook that was run by a guy called Hugo Greenhoff, who's I think that's how you pronounce his name. Apologies if that's wrong. He's a journalist with Reuters, I think. But he was given a collection of diaries by this guy called Mr. Lucas, who was a English civil servant who I think he befriended at some point just before he died, and he's been uploading this guy's diaries bit by bit. I think there's sort of 60 or 70 years worth of diaries to a Facebook page, and it's absolutely fascinating because it's very much like not someone who has made any dent in a historical record of any meaning, yet lived this life that was sort of is a slice of life, I guess, of being a gay man in London in the 20th century. And what's particularly fascinating about him, a bit like Samuel Delaney, is his sort of recollections and discussion of public sex. And for him, it was cottaging, which is English slang meaning sort of picking up guys and having sex in public toilets. And so he was this very fascinating, kind of mean guy with some very problematic viewpoints on. He was a snob and some very problematic viewpoints on the lower classes and on people of color and things like this and women. He worked for the British Civil Service, and then he would sort of go out after work and dip into public toilets and meet men and sometimes take them home. And it's a real sort of slice of life because it mixes his sort of personal opinions and things that are going on in his life with this fascinating sex diary, and then also the repercussions of it, I guess. So being blackmailed and being bullied, and his fears of being outed, and his difficulties of maintaining sort of emotional and fulfilling personal life. And yeah, it's just a fascinating archive, I guess. And it's really amazing that it was kept and passed on. I'm kind of surprised. This is the sort of thing that quite a lot of people might burn before they die. And then is being sort of very slowly, thoroughly, and with great care sort of read through and uploaded by someone as in some ways, like, I guess, an act of love or an act of care for the historical record. And it's just, yeah, for me, it's just an amazing document and so vibrant. So that's what I'd recommend if people can dig that out on Facebook. He was called Mr. Lucas was his name, yeah.
How about Ben? Do you have any recommendations for our listeners?
I do. I want to recommend two things. One of them is Huw's Substack newsletter, which I promise he has not asked me to plug, but it's really good. And I have been really thinking a lot in the past few months about how terrible the state of our public debate is basically everywhere, and how few things you see and read that you really sort of get excited about and want to push on with, and how few essays and criticism sort of have this really rigorous intellectual and ethical stance. And I think Huw's do, and he writes about things that are interesting and important, and says things that are original, and I highly recommend it. And the other thing that I would recommend is a really amazing website run by a trans woman, a historian named Zagria. Zagria.blogspot.com, ZAGREI.blogspot.com. And the title of the blog is A Gender Variance Who's Who. And it's someplace that we've turned to a lot when we've been looking at kind of trans stories. And she collects a huge kind of index of trans histories and biographies, and includes a lot of primary sources, and does really kind of interesting and important public history work. And I think people should really check that out as a way of getting to some really interesting trans history work that's going on in public, and maybe a little bit in the shadows, and certainly outside the academic spotlight.
So just on that note, I do find those sort of personal sort of archives just the most fascinating things because they're produced in such a way that the very production tells you something about people's own relationship with their sexuality. Like to go to that effort to create these sort of small archive blogs that grow like that, for example, shows you that there's something like really missing. It reminds me of this book that a couple of friends gave me actually in Barcelona, which was in Spanish. It's called 100 Gays, and it's just a list of 100 profiles of gay guys. And it was published at some point, I think in the early 90s or late 80s. But they gave it to me, and it's full of annotations from an unknown person. I actually have written about it on my blog. There's an article about it on my Substack, an essay, because it's full of annotations of their own lists of people who they think are gay or might be gay. That includes, sort of Spanish celebrities. Even Franco appears on this list at some point with their own annotations about the nature of their sexuality, whether they're sort of repressed inverts or pederasts or whatever. And then it ends at the end of the book. There's in the sort of blank pages left at the end of the book, a whole series of poems that they'd written about their perfect society, which happens to be, wouldn't you know it, a lesbian convent, with everyone dressed as communist workers in blue overalls. This is an amazing sort of document written by someone maybe in the closet, presumably at some sort of time of much lesser acceptance of LGBTQ identities. And I have no idea who it is. There's no name in it, which makes it even more amazing. And I see these sort of blogs where people start to upload these own, not just personal archives, but archives of things that they recognize. There's another great one called Jarry, which is I can't remember the exact URL, but a UK blog, which is just representations in British satirical magazines of gay people dating back sort of 80 years, I think, including a whole archive of sort of every representation of a gay person in Private Eye magazine, which is, again, just this fascinating work of passion by this one person who's like seen a pattern and wants to put it somewhere. So yeah, I love these sort of resources.
Yeah, this sounds amazing, and we encourage our listeners to check that out, but not before they check out the Bad Gays podcast, the Bad Gays Homosexual History book. Thank you very, very much for speaking to us. You have been our first and probably for a long time only non-Polish speaker, so this is unique and we're very grateful.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for having the conversation in English with us, and thanks to your listeners for going along with that. We're really grateful to be here and to be speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I tak dojechałyśmy do końca sezonu 3, na razie ostatniego podcastu Oswoić Gender. Bardzo dziękujemy za bycie z nami i słuchanie.
Bardzo serdecznie dziękujemy i do usłyszenia. 3. sezon podcastu Oswoić Gender realizowany jest dzięki dofinansowaniu na promocję badań w ramach programu Inicjatywa Doskonałości Uczelnia Badawcza Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego.
Realizacją dźwięku i montażem zajęła się Julia Machnowska, zaś nagranie i studio zaopiekowała Magdalena Sowul, tworząca jako Pani Las. Podcast znajdziecie na Spotify, Apple Podcast, Pocket Cast i Google Podcast oraz na YouTubie.
Some stories that you found maybe more difficult to tell, or you...
I heard the dog.
Yes. She was shaking off all of this progressive drivel that we've been spouting. Yeah. No, I'm telling you, when you come to Warsaw, I will show her to you, and you'll see the conservatism written out on her cute little face.